Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who I can honestly say knows about as much about video game music as I do.
Tim Longo.
Yes, an ongoing theme on this podcast, almost a musical theme, is our anti-musicality, because it's something we know very little about. So, we've done something about it. It's a suggestion of a listener. Thanks, Biostats. We're joined today by Sebastian Deken, a writer and musician born in St. Louis, Missouri. Sebastian studied music and French literature at Washington University in St. Louis, and then went on to receive his MFA in nonfiction writing from Columbia University School of the Arts. Currently lives in New York City with his husband, Brett White. We're speaking to him today in connection with his new book, which will have come out just yesterday in paperback from Boss Fight Books when this airs, but is already available via ebook if you're so inclined. Sebastian, welcome to Dev Game Club.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So are we, because as I alluded to there, we are genuinely terrible at thinking and talking about music when it comes to video games, which is a shame, right? Because it is, right, we do give, we do give proper kudos in our development to the audio side of audiovisual experience, right? But one of the things that we just have a hard time talking about is audio a bit, but even more specifically music. It is just a hard thing for us to even think to talk about. Before we get into talking about the music proper, I wonder if you could kind of give me a little rundown on how you came to video games, and maybe then, to looking at the music in them, separately. Yeah,
sure. So, first of all, don't feel bad for not feeling like you're not able to talk about music. It's, I think, one of the most difficult things to talk or write about, because it's so abstract, but we react to it in such a primal way. So, don't beat yourself up is what I'm saying. But yeah, in terms of how I came to video games, I just have played them all my life. I think that's probably the story with most of the folks you talk to. But, I remember picking up my first Nintendo controller, but not my first steps, my first word, or anything like that. Of course, you pick up the Nintendo controller a little bit later in life, but we'll set that aside. And so played all my life as I got into middle school, and especially when I started playing this game. Around the same time, I started developing a real interest in music, and I kind of as I studied music, I sort of kept my love of video games afloat as I was studying music, and I really have been interested in that confluence, that intersection of the two, pretty much, I think, from the jump. I wrote a little bit of music. It was terrible. Wrote a little bit of music in middle school, and actually, if you Google my name, you will see that I transcribed when I was in 5th or 6th grade. I transcribed from some music from the NES game Star Tropics. I transcribed it into MIDI format. And uploaded it to one of those video game music MIDI sites that you could download music from. So I was pretty into it from the jump.
Yeah, I'll say.
Yeah, and then I was in. I guess I'll just go into the story about how I pitched the book. I was in grad school, and the only required class was this research seminar, and I put it off until my last semester. And by the time I got there, I was working full time while I was doing my MFA program. And by the time I got to this research seminar, I was just exhausted. And I was like, I'm going to do something stupid. And by stupid, I just mean fun. So I decided, you know what? I've done a lot of music criticism in school, in grad school so far. Love video games, love video game music. I'm going to write about video game music. So I researched live performances of Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy music, specifically, well, like I guess like live performances of video game music as a whole, but naturally, like it sort of led to these two because, you know, Dragon Quest, as far as I could tell, was like the first one ever performed live in like 1987, 88 or something. It was something crazy like that, way before it came to the US. You know, Final Fantasy was like the first big performance of video game music in the US. So it just sort of like landed on these two. And I wrote this research paper on it. I spent the whole semester researching. I wrote this research paper on it. And then my buddy, I got to give him a shout out, my buddy Matt Shafiq, who reads the boss fight books. And I had read a few while I was in grad school as well. He was on their website. He noticed they were taking pitches, and they were taking pitches about this game specifically. He was like, hey, you should pitch to them. I was like, okay, cool. So I think the window was about to close or something. I was like, well, I don't have time to write a chapter. So I just sent Gabe Durham, the editor there, my research paper, and was like, hey, I want to write about Final Fantasy VI, and here's why. And to my surprise, he called me back, you know, like a few months later. He gave me a phone call, sort of, I think, out of the blue. And I was shocked. And then from there, I just, you know, downhill from there. Here we are.
Well, I wouldn't say downhill, because I've read, as I was saying in pre-show, I've read about the first third. I've just swamped lately, so I haven't quite gotten all the way through it. But I've read a number of boss fight books, and they're great. They're the perfect length for the topics that they address, and
really wonderful.
And yeah, it's a wonderful series, and it's in, oh God, I don't know, 7th or 8th season or something like that now. I'm not sure about that. I went and looked, and I didn't write it down. So
yeah, I forget. I know mine is number 28, but I can't remember.
Well, there you go. End of maybe beginning of season 7 or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, is this a game that had a special place in your heart? I mean, if you're starting with the NES, I'm guessing maybe, yeah.
Yeah, it absolutely is. You know, I was a Nintendo purist, and so I never owned like a Sega or a PlayStation or anything. So I owned you know, a Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and 64, and then I think GameCube came out like right around the time I was going to college. So I never actually picked one of those up. That's actually a shocker that I've never picked up a GameCube controller in my life. But yeah, you know, I started playing the original Final Fantasy on the NES, and it was hilarious because I didn't own it. I was borrowing it from my best friend's older brother. And for those of you who haven't like played the game, you can't like go to an inn to restore your hit points and magic points without saving, and there's only one save slot. So I could not save over my best friend's brother's game. So all I could do is just like play as far as I could play without dying. So I was like, you know, like over and over again playing the beginning of the game until I finally like 6 months in convinced him to let me to let me save over his game. But yeah, I was obsessed with it, and Final Fantasy II, when I found out, like I ran across that in a video game rental shop. I didn't have like a subscription to Nintendo Power or anything. Like, you know, I just had no idea that Final Fantasy II even existed. Final Fantasy IV actually, but Final Fantasy II in the States. Had no idea that it actually existed until I ran across it in a video game rental place, and then rented it, was obsessed, and then you know, sort of like with my friend's brother, I kept renting this game over and over and over again, and I kept like delaying my parents from returning it, to the extent that like they would not let my dad rent from Blockbuster anymore. Like we actually had to get, like, my mom had to get her own account, so that, because my dad was like blacklisted, we just racked up so many late fees, and we were not like a wealthy family. So anyway, like it got to the point where like my parents were like, we're just gonna buy this kid the game. My dad like went to Toys R Us and they didn't have Final Fantasy 2, but they did have Final Fantasy 3. So that's what he brought home. And I was like, they have a Final Fantasy 3? Cool. And I popped it in, and then I was like literally just like obsessed from the first like cutscene when the Magitech armor is like it's like the mode 7 like 3D thing,
right?
The Magitech is walking across the tundra. That music there like stunned me, and I was obsessed from there on out.
Oh, that's really fantastic. We've mentioned before, I listened to Kirk Hamilton's podcast about music called Strong Songs, and he's done some video game ones as well. It's interesting to me because he's another person who I think of as like, he's a professional musician. He spent a number of years as a games journalist. Now he's back to being a musician, and he knew from the same sort of age that he was a musician, like that that music was a big part of his life.
Yeah.
And it makes me also think, that's why I don't know how to talk about it because I wasn't that for me. Right. I never figured out how to talk about it.
Yeah. It's like being a gymnast. Like I think about like Olympic gymnasts, like I could not like just pick that up right now. My body is too old and frail. Like I'm not an old man, but like, like I'm in my 30s, like, it's just not going to happen, Sebastian. Like, no matter how many times you watch the Olympics, you're never going to be Simone Biles. So, I was never going to be Simone Biles anyway. But I was going to say,
I don't know if anyone else is ever going to be Simone Biles, to be honest.
But yeah, it's that kind of like, you have to, in some ways, like, it's not true for everyone, but like in some ways, you do have to kind of like have that knack for it in life. A lot of people. There's this sort of like running theory that like if you really want to be like a virtuosic instrumentalist, it's different for singers. I can explain why if you want later, but if you really want to be a virtuosic instrumentalist, you have to pick it up from a very young age and sort of like be going like at the violin, at the piano from like the time you're like in grade school. Otherwise, you just like you don't have the capacity. It's like language learning, right? Like your brain changes around puberty. Yeah. It like changes around puberty and you're like less capable of picking up language. So I think it's kind of the same thing with music.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, right? It's a language, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tim. You were going to say.
Oh no, I was gonna actually ask another subject. So Brett, if you wanted to keep on that, but I was going to ask actually about sort of what brought you to nonfiction writing specifically, because we're obviously talking about music, and as a musician, you're perfect for that. And then, and the game and gaming, but also there's this element of like, you also are kind of perfect for writing a nonfiction book about music, about video games, and that's what your MFA is in. So, what's your journey kind of on from that side of things?
Yeah, I attempted to be a professional musician. I studied opera in college, and in my early and mid 20s, I was trying to be an opera singer. I was like doing gigs around the St. Louis area. I did some opera, like I was in some opera courses. I did some concert singing. I sang in the St. Louis Symphony Chorus, which is probably like one of the best experiences of my life. It was so awesome. It's not like the most like, it's not like I was up on stage, like singing, the Brahms Requiem or whatever, but, I was like in the chorus, like sitting behind the trombone players and like getting the full like surround sound thing from on stage. It was so, so cool, to sing in that chorus. But yeah, I have debilitating stage fright. And it doesn't apply to like public speaking. I could get up in front of a crowd and talk like unscripted. I'm totally comfortable doing that. But when it came to singing, there was something like deep inside me that just like locked up whenever I had to do that. And so, I could talk myself out of it, but it takes a lot of like emotional and mental energy to do that. And at a certain point, it was just getting like worse and worse the further into my career that I got. And at a certain point, I had to say like, what am I getting out of this versus what am I putting into this? And I had to, like make the decision to step away from it. Meanwhile, I was sort of like dabbling in writing a little bit. He's now my husband. We met in 2010. Brett is a writer. He was writing for Upright Citizens Brigade. He was writing for one of their weekly sketch shows, and now he's a TV journalist. But he was a writer. A lot of his friends were writers and comedians, and so they kind of like, I don't know, they like kind of saw the stuff that I was doing. They were like, "Hey, you're pretty good at this," and my husband was like, "Hey, you're pretty good at this," and a couple of my friends from undergrad got MFAs, and I just sort of like was watching them from afar, like, that's interesting. So I got this job working at Columbia, and they do tuition remission. And so, I mean, they don't like automatically let you in. You still have to like apply, and there's no thing to like check, yes, I'm an employee on the application. So, you have to apply and like get in. And I applied to this MFA program and I got in. It was the only place I applied, and everyone in, MFA programs wants to strangle me because a lot of folks like, it's really like, honestly, it's more competitive to get into most MFA programs than it is to get into Harvard Law. Like, it's just like, it's that level. There's so many people, and they by nature have to have so few spots to make it like a worthwhile experience for their writers and poets. So, so I ended up, sorry, that sounded like a real like backdoor humble brag. That's not what I said at all, but whatever, it doesn't matter.
No worries.
So I just kind of ended up by accident at Columbia in their MFA program. And I, while I was there, I took a class called Criticism as a Literary Genre with Margot Jefferson, who was for years and years a theater, dance, music critic with the New York Times. She has a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, she wrote that great Michael Jackson short book, right?
Oh wow, yeah, she did.
Yeah, I read that a couple of years ago. Because I understood it to be the book, to read, especially for a short one. I'm familiar with the work. I think I read something else after that as well because I was so fond of the writing.
Yeah, she's fantastic. She was, she ended up being my thesis advisor as well. I just like ended up like, this was kind of the direction I wanted to go. I remember after a workshop one day, we were like sitting down going through one of my pieces, and I was like, I kind of want to be a critic professionally. And she looked at me and she was like, that makes sense. And I was like, Margot Jefferson just told me it makes sense for me to be a critic. So I'm going to give this a shot. Of course, there's a lot of anxiety involved in writing, but it's less, it's kind of like you spread it out and it's very private versus like, when you're performing on stage, you have to like swallow it and just like step up there and pretend like it's not happening. Whereas like you can have as many panic attacks as you want when you're, when you're behind a computer screen, no one sees it. Except for your editors, you call them crying some nights. That was cool. A sort of roundabout way of saying how I got here.
No, it's fascinating. It's I think one of the things that our listeners always love, no matter who we have on, is just to hear about, how they got here and from all the different directions. And obviously because of the book, it's a pretty appropriate topic to bring up. And then you bring in the opera angle of what you were doing before, and then it's even more appropriate for Final Fantasy VI too. So it's like, wow, there's a Venn diagram here that worked out pretty well. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, when I remember when Gabe called me about my pitch, he was like, "Why are you the person to write this book, and why is this the book to write about?" And I was like, "Funny you should ask Gabe." And so I told him basically the same story about being a singer, and obviously it connects back really strongly to the game. And then I explained, sort of like what I was thinking about the game's music, and here we are.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the things digging into the music, and one of the first insights I took away, in the first third, and like I said, I'm looking forward to reading all of it, because it's also, I will say, it's helping me think about the sorts of things I can think about when I hear game music, which is super helpful. And there are not a lot of books, I should say, that let you do that or help you do that. It's you point out, you sort of had done some of the earlier history of the JRPGs with Sugiyama in particular, with Dragon Quest, who you mentioned earlier. This insight that you have about the switching between the genres of music that Uematsu does, really matching the sort of hodgepodge style of the games themselves, the Final Fantasy series themselves, and I thought that was really an interesting point, and not something I had ever considered. Like I hear that a lot in sort of later Mario games, for example, where there's tons of different styles, but I think that's become more of a, like, let's freshen up this music, we're going to stick with it, but let's give whole new instrumentation, or whatever, and it's going to be the same old things that you hear, in terms of the themes and things like that. But I really love that. I wonder if you could sort of dive into that a little bit and talk about some of the different genres of music that he was working from in general, and in this soundtrack in particular.
Yeah, so I think if you the first thing that comes up if you Google like Uematsu musical influences, I think like you see prog rock is like the number one thing that you'll find in the interviews that he has. And it's funny because, like, Final Fantasy is kind of steampunky in a lot of its world, especially in Final Fantasy VI, and prog rock is like the steampunk of music, because it really it really takes rock, but also infuses, it takes a lot of different stuff, but like infuses this really sort of like epic kind of classical element as well. In terms of this hodgepodge of styles, there's that prog rock, which sort of, it allows him, above the sort of backbeat, the backbone of a drum set and an electric bass, to like bring in a string section and a horn section, and that kind of stuff. So it sort of like sets the sphere, like it creates the environment for the rest of the music to come in and out, because it's like, okay, well, I'm already listening to something like that is new and different. So when he brings in different things that are sort of from unexpected places, you just kind of accept it. So yeah, he draws on all different kinds of styles. Celtic in music is another big influence of his. But you can hear in Final Fantasy VI specifically, there's like industrial in like the Magitech factory. It's very like Nine Inch Nails. In Shadow's theme, it's very like Morricone, like film score, like Western, spaghetti Western kind of thing. And, you hear like Indiana Jones in Locke, and in Setzer's theme. It's very like, you can hear that he's pulling from that sort of area. And I'm forgetting, there are a million other things. But also, like, if you look over the history of the series, if you think about the Chocobo music, in each game, he uses that exact same thing, but puts it into a different genre, and he does that very sort of intentionally. So, in the first game, I think it's Final Fantasy II where you first hear the music. It's like, it is just the theme. But like, in Final Fantasy IV, they have like a samba theme when you're, is it samba? Or I think it's samba when you're on the black chocobo, the one that flies. There's the techno one in Final Fantasy VI, and then he has like a surf rock one in Final Fantasy VII. It's like, he's just kind of all over the place. He loves all different kinds of music, and so he's able to just sort of like, like we said with music in general, like, he speaks all these different languages. So he must have really been listening to like a diverse a diverse set of music growing up, because you really hear that come through. Yeah, and those are like shortcuts to let you know what to think about what's happening in a lot of, like, the Chocobo music less so, but
right, yeah, I mean, because that's repeated again and again, and it's kind of, it's also kind of in a way the Chocobo takes you out of the game in a certain sense, right? Because can have the encounters and things like that, right? So it's kind of the anti-game element of
that's funny. It is funny. Yeah, it's sort of a reprieve from all the random battles. So
like the elevator music.
Yeah.
I mean the hodgepodge, or however you describe it, about just because we've talked about that. We played Final Fantasy IX, and then we've played this one, and one of the themes that we come back to from a development perspective is just how diverse the experiences are in a Final Fantasy game. And it's not to say that a Western RPG doesn't have some of that too, but we recently played Baldur's Gate, the original Baldur's Gate as well, and Western RPGs tend to be fairly cohesive when it comes to style and tone, right? Especially ones that are Tolkien-esque, and so the music tends to fall within a certain band, and the activities you do are pretty much, are within a certain systems set that you're going to repeat. And there's definitely that here too, but they also have these one-off sequences that allow flexibility for the developers in a Final Fantasy game to do a bunch of different crazy things. And then to be a composer for a game like that, it does feel like you need to give yourself flexibility to be able to accommodate and support, and in some cases drive, maybe, like the opera is a good example. Like that the music is driving that sequence in a way. So you have to have some sort of way to not be able to give yourself permission to break out of one particular style and to do whatever you need to. Like the Zozo music specifically is one that comes to mind, where I think it was the first moment that I sort of noticed how different, going from basically the overworld music to Zozo, and you're like, wow, this is so different from what I was just listening to.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel wrong, didn't feel like I was jarred out of the experience. It still was okay, because I kind of knew, okay, this place is going to be different. This is a mischievous thief kind of, area, thieving kind of area, which it was. And it's just astounding how he was able to bounce around.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think about like Ultima as like a Western RPG, it's very much just like a plain vanilla fantasy. I don't mean that in like a pejorative sense, but like
I know what you mean. Yes,
but yeah, like what to expect when you're going.
It's called Ultima, so I mean, it's gonna be pretty.
Yeah. So, but yeah, they have like less flexibility when they're writing that music, right? Because if you're listening to prog rock when you're playing Ultima, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, maybe there's a way they could, I don't know, maybe if it were like not Ultima, they could do it. But yeah, it really takes a game that sort of is as crazy as Final Fantasy is in order to do the things that Uematsu does. And, it has to be a hodgepodge, a patchwork, a quilt of a game in order for him to quilt together all these different styles.
Quilt. That's a good one. I like that.
I wonder too if it has to do with the fact that, I'm trying to think of Western RPGs where this is the case, if I'm just not thinking of any, but I tend to think of Japanese RPGs as often taking place across a whole planet. Right. I mean, and especially with the Final Fantasy series where, it has airships, right? It has fast travel means, basically, where it can go a long way. I mean, even on a really big RPG like Skyrim, on which I worked, right? It's just one little area, relative to the planet. You're not going all over whatever the continent is called, and this is how good an Elder Scrolls
Toril. Yeah,
sure, okay. You're not going to everywhere there. You're just like in this one neighborhood, basically. And the same is true of Baldur's Gate, right? You're not all over. You're just in this Sword Coast area, this one kind of section. And it's not like you're going to whatever the equivalent of the sort of Eastern, area of, and because you mentioned Cyan in the book about, him being from Doma and that being sort of coded as, other, I guess is the term you use. I would almost say Orientalist with some of the stuff you point out, but
yeah, it's funny, but it's funny because Uematsu is from
exactly right. I mean, that's why it doesn't really read that way. It is,
but it's funny. I played Skyrim a little bit. It's funny you should mention it. I was playing Skyrim recently, and it's a huge world. Like, it is taking place maybe in this one, like in the confines of this one place on the planet, but like it's enormous. I found it terrifying how big that map was.
Yeah. Well, me too.
And I bet, yeah,
for different reasons. I
yeah. But yeah, but at the same time, there's less flexibility in terms of like what the sound can be, right? Whereas like Final Fantasy VI, the maps are so much smaller, but you can really just do whatever you want. Like, who cares? Oh, you want to sound like Trent Reznor? Fine, we'll find a place for that. It's cool. Yeah, they really sort of like give him. He really sort of has carte blanche because of like how insane those games are. They're just nuts. They're Final Fantasy VI in particular is just bonkers.
Point of clarity, I was wrong. I had them backwards. Tamriel is Elder Scrolls. Toril is Forgotten Realms. Yeah. So I had them backwards, but yeah. I mean,
those are so distinct.
I know. Yeah.
And I don't know how you can mix that up.
I could have mixed them up. Well, I mean, like it is interesting to kind of pit the Elder Scrolls series toward Final Fantasy in that. One of the things you come to the Elder Scrolls games kind of for each one in the series is to sort of see a new region. And so there's almost an expectation that, okay, I want to live in the Viking region of this world now. This is the whole game. And then Morrowind, right? I want to live in the Dark Elf area of this, of this region or of this game. So you're kind of like, you're sort of building it over a long period of time. But like every single Final Fantasy game is sort of like all encompassing because, I mean, I'm fairly new to the JRPG genre and you probably don't know that, Sebastian, but for me, I'm kind of discovering this a bit anew, and Brett is much more. He's played many more of them, and they kind of restart the story every time. So it's like your expectation is that you're going to see a new world every time in a way, and there's some similarities, of course, and things they pull from each one, but it's kind of like. I just, for both 9 and for 6, every time for each of those games that we've played, I just am always so blown away at like the variety, and just like it is this grand high adventure. And if the music had been within a certain style or band, and been sort of quote unquote safe the whole time, I don't think that sort of sense of seeing this diverse world would have landed at all. I feel like the music is critical for that to work, especially in a 16-bit game where the fidelity on the visual side is so limited. The music is going to speak volumes more than anything else, it feels like.
Yeah, I think you're bang on. The music does by nature have to do a lot of work in setting, in character. It does a lot of work, and I think that's why some really memorable game scores come from the like the 16-bit era. Right. Like you think of Final Fantasy VI, you think of Chrono Trigger. This is like a less common one to bring up, but I love Super Mario RPG.
Yeah, fun one.
Yeah, because that one's just like the music from that one is a lot of fun too. But yeah, you have to do. I mean, it's not to say that like the more sort of higher fidelity like live recorded scores that we hear today aren't doing work, but they really sort of had to lean more heavily on the music to do it. And part of that is because it doesn't matter if you're listening to sound samples. Music is music, and it doesn't matter if it's 8-bit sounds from like triangle and square waves from the NES, or if it's sound samples from the Super Nintendo, it still has that same effect, right? It can still raise the hair on your arms. And that's what I think is so interesting, is that like in some ways, like the music didn't really need to evolve very much. You know, like they probably, a lot of games still do like pixel art, but like a lot of games still do that same kind of sound sometimes, you know? Yeah. So
it's nostalgic for people, I think, too, right?
Yeah.
To want to hear that, the down res sort of music. But you're right, it's universal. I mean, even in its fidelity, it still works really well. And I'm just, as we're talking, I'm kind of trying to imagine Final Fantasy VI with like a consistent style of musical theme throughout the whole thing. And I just, it wouldn't have been the same game at all. I mean, like the first cue you have, I mentioned Zozo, every town having its own theme, going open world versus battling. I mean, the first cue you often have is the music of where you are and what you're doing, because you can't really take the visuals in in a quick way often on what's going on because of the fidelity. So yeah, it's fascinating, and it's interesting to know. I mean, of course, I think this maybe is a plug for the book as far as like, if you want more, read the book, kind of thing. But I mean, like, how did you, from a process perspective on writing the book, like, to Brett's point, it's helping him, and I apologize, I haven't started it myself, but it's helping him understand how to talk about music. Like, how did you approach writing a book for, I assume essentially your audience is sort of, you're thinking non-musicians, how do you write a book about music for non-musician game players? Like, what was your approach?
Yeah, some of the book, there are like excerpts of music, like
right,
like musical figures like in the book. So you do see some of that, but like I didn't write it so that you need to be able to read music to enjoy the book.
Yeah. I mean, it's helpful to see. I mean, you do. I saw where you circle some notes, right, to point out, and you talk about, and the writing really complements it well. So I do want to say, like, yeah, I mean, if you don't read music, I happen to, but if you don't read music, you can certainly get everything out of the descriptions of what you're seeing, and sort of the patterns of just seeing, like, look, this one's higher than that one, then lower.
Yeah.
Look at how the shape is the same in this other piece, from something else. So continue. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I think it's good for folks, for non-musicians to say that rather than me saying it, because it's like, if I say, like, oh yeah, I was, like writing this so everyone could enjoy it. It just, I don't know. But yeah, I was sort of writing this for, it was a tightrope, right? I was writing this for a general audience. I was also writing it so that musicians wouldn't feel like I was dumbing it down. And I hate to use the phrase dumbing it down.
But I know what you mean. Yeah.
But yeah, like, I wasn't oversimplifying for musicians. And, right. For games folks too, and for people who knew game music, I didn't want them to feel like I was starting from square one. So it was a little bit of a tightrope walk. I think you need to assume that I went in with the assumption that people sort of the experience of listening to music is universal, right? Like, whatever kind of music you like, it does the same thing to you.
Sure.
And you kind of start from there, and use that kernel as sort of your North Star as you're writing, and figure out, okay, well, if I'm going to describe a particular piece, what do I say that, and how do I say it such that people understand what they would be feeling if they were listening to the piece. And I go pretty heavily into sort of like picking apart character themes is one thing that I do in several sections in the book. And you have to sorry, you're gonna have to cut out a lot of silences here.
That's fine. You know what, it's just like jazz, it's the notes you don't play.
No worries at all.
Yeah, you have to figure out a way to talk about it. Like I said earlier, it's really, really difficult to write about music. And so I happen to be a person who, even when I'm just speaking in conversation, I rely really heavily on analogy. And I think that comes in handy when you're talking about music, because, you know, if you're being really, really technical, you don't need to do that. But if you're trying to describe what a piece sounds like to, you know, some like a general audience, like if I were talking to music theorists about this book, I could talk about the chord progression. Like I went in and I have like a digital copy of the score where I went in and like marked up what the chord progressions were, and sort of like for my own reference. And I thought about going into this much detail in the book. I'm glad I didn't. But like marking up what those looked like from like a theoretical, I mean, it's like music theory 101, but it's still music theory. And sort of like seeing where the cadences come. And, you know, I can talk to like a musicologist or, you know, someone who's studied music theory. I can talk to them about that. But, you know, I'm not going to talk to you about like where there's a deceptive cadence, where there's a plagal cadence. Like those don't mean anything to most people. Right. And, you know, like similarly, like when you talk about counterpoint, like that, you know, that means something to some people, but not the same thing necessarily to music theorists. So I stayed away from that a lot. And I really, you know, I went to the music when I thought it would be helpful to the actual like musical score. Like I pulled excerpts from that and put it in the book when I thought it would be helpful to non-musicians. Like Brett said, you know, there are places where I like circle notes and I'm like, here, look at the shape here versus the shape here. You can see similarities, you can see differences, you kind of, you can sort of see visually. And that's why I did that. So even non-musicians would be able to appreciate that. Musicians would, you know, probably get a little bit more from that. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I really relied pretty heavily on not talking about music to talk about music, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, you have a variety of audiences. You have to try to, yeah, like you said, walk the tightrope, which I think is, yeah, I mean, that makes sense especially for boss fight books and their goals.
Yeah, I was gonna say it would be very daunting, you know, for you know, or the normal target, I would say, of the series or of the, I don't know, publication line or whatever, to address in that way. And I will say that, you know, reading you mentioned the character descriptions, which is kind of the section I'm in now. I'm reading the section about Shadow, just finishing that one. But the one about Relm totally made me rethink the character in light of the music, and it made me think, oh, okay, now this is what I need to be doing, right? Is that, you know, when I think about music in games, is looking at it in that way, like listening to the music and feeling so just in isolation. I think actually, and this is one of the things that makes it difficult for me and for us to talk about, is that we're also playing the game. Yeah. You know, and so, you know, we're often very focused on sort of our more comfort zones in terms of that stuff. Narrative for me, I'm a huge reader, so I just naturally go straight to the words, right? You know, Tim, of course, is a professional designer, right? And he, you know, talks a lot about those things as well, right? Yeah. But, you know, to then pull back, I think I actually need to like separately maybe sometimes listen to those to get at it. But it's super helpful to me to have that framework.
Yeah, it's funny that you mention Relm, because she really is in the game. She's almost a throwaway character. She really is, like, she comes in, I think she's like the last like real character that's introduced. I mean, you run into like Umaro and Gogo, but they're, you know,
right. And they're in the second half. Yeah. Optional.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But she's kind of the last character to come in. You get to know her the least through the words. And, you know, she doesn't play like a huge role in the plot. But it wasn't, you know, I didn't think very much of her as a character until I sat down and started listening to the themes. And I always wondered, and I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about the music here for folks who don't know Relm's theme. It might be helpful to go give it a quick listen.
I'll put it in. I'll put it in with the
great,
as an undertone. Yeah,
great. Yeah. So it, you know, what I always noticed about her theme, like even when I was playing it as a kid, was the way that there's almost nothing there. There's a lot of in between points. You know, there's a lot of times when the music just feels like it's resting, and it doesn't have a very like singable melody in the first section. Like the second section more so does, but the first section is very much just like it feels like you're listening to something ambient. And I you know, I always thought about that and wondered why that is, especially for a character who comes in so late in the game. You would think that Uematsu would really go hard on sort of like musical description of this character so that you have a better idea of who the hell she is.
Yeah, how to feel about her.
Yeah. But it's very, very subtle. And when I was sitting down to write the book, I was like, why is that? Let me figure that out. And she seems like such a strange character to feature, quote unquote, in the book. But the more I sat with her music, the more I looked at it, the more I sort of compared it to other themes in the book, and especially Shadow's theme. I thought there was some really interesting like conversation between those two themes. The more I understood what was happening. And I think it takes several listens to really get it for almost any music. There's very little, you know, even for me, a music guy, like sometimes I sit down and listen to an album and I'm like, whatever. And then I listen to it again. And then like, by the third time I listen to it, I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. And, you know, I kind of, I rock out to it. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Relm grew to be one of my. I guess it is true that there isn't a lot with her, but I don't know, for whatever reason, some of her sections were the one where you get her after the breaking of the world and with all the painting and stuff. That was one of my favorite sequences, and she's a permanent in my party now. I just love the idea of her, and she's kind of got this attitude.
Yeah, she's very sassy.
People keep talking about, you know, and she's like, when you bring her back into your party, she's like, let's go get that fool, you know, or something like that. It's talking about Kefka, and I'm like, this little girl's all right. So I need to go back and pay more attention to her music then, and definitely read the book about it. So
yeah, and it's also weird because it's very sweet. And she's such a she's you wouldn't describe her as sweet. It's not that
tart.
She's like,
you'd say tart.
Yeah, you wouldn't. She's not mean, but she's not like a sweetie pie.
No.
She's very sassy, but the music isn't that at all. So, you know, again, I was like, why is that? Like, what's going on here?
Wow.
So yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I won't go into it.
Read the book and find out, right?
Yeah, read the book and find out. But yeah, it's really interesting. I think why, at least my analysis, my interpretation, because it's different for everyone, right? Like you could ask 100 people why this theme works, and you'd get 100 different answers. But like, I thought it was really interesting for the reasons that I sort of drew out and outlined in the book. Yeah.
It's interesting you found some correlation. It sounds like you found maybe some correlation with Shadow as well, which we kind of talked about. I guess we found out it was post game and
well, I mean, there's more in the game, I think, I think reading actually this book actually put some of it in context, but you actually have to play the game twice, I gather, to get the whole story.
Yep.
And having all of the story makes it pretty clear what's going on.
Okay.
So that's the kind of thing that I didn't realize, and I think people were probably fairly obtuse if they felt they had to ask, like in a journalistic setting, like based on the events that happen. It's like, oh, well, clearly, like, why are you asking me this? This is obvious, I could see, anyway, so we're 50 minutes in and I feel almost embarrassed, but we have an former opera singer.
Holy crap! Yeah,
and we haven't talked about the opera scene at all. And maybe it's a good place to end as sort of a major topic, because it's probably the most talked about. I mean, the structure of the game is, I think, a big thing, right? Because of the big narrative, like, oh, hey, the world, came to its climactic moment and you lost, right? Okay, so that's a thing. But I think really in terms of, and so that was new. But the real amazing thing is when I was playing that opera scene and just going, how were they doing this back then? Like, how is this possible that this is in this game, was my response to that section. So, I haven't read your section yet in the book about it, so I will be getting to that, and I'll get your full opinions there. But I'd love to hear, especially as an opera singer, like, just anything about this scene.
Yeah, so oh boy, do I have a lot to say about this. I actually could have spent a lot more time in the book on the opera scene, but there's a lot to cover, and even I, like, looking back, I'm like, oh, shoot, I wish I had written about this. But yeah, how did they do that? I think is it's la question du jour. Like, who knows? Because narratively speaking, this scene is not necessary, right? Like, you don't need to have an opera in this game in order to move the plot forward in the way it needs to be moved forward. What the characters need at this point is the airship. And
right. So, it's funny you say. So funny you say that, because, like, I don't even. I'm like, why? You're talking about it. I'm like, why are they? What were they doing here?
Exactly. It's insane that they were like, oh, they need an airship. Let's send them to the opera. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, there are 100 other ways they could have done it. They could have, like, in the auction house, in Jadur, you, like, bid on a model airship, and there could have been something there where, like, you run into Setzer there and get the airship from him there, or, like, bump into him on the street. There are just, like, 100 other ways that it could have happened that make sense, whereas, like, an opera does not. But the fact that they chose to do this is so interesting in such a number of ways, because the game in itself, and I'm not the first person to say this. I have to give a shout out to Ryan Thompson, a musicologist, for pointing this out. But the game itself is very much its own opera. It's split into, you could think of it in 2 acts if you think about the first half and the second half. You could also think about it in 3 acts, as Ryan Thompson does. The beginning of the game is the first act. The second act is right after Terra, transforms into an Esper for the first time. And the third act is when Celeste wakes up on this. So it's like every time someone wakes up from something, there's a new act. So you could think of it that way as well. And, that's how operas are structured by and large, is in 3 acts. There's a lot more to the parallels between the game and an opera that I'm just like, it's not worth going into in terms of this discussion. But so it's interesting that they chose to go there, because I don't even know that they did that on purpose, to be quite honest. Like, I think there are a lot of happy accidents in this game, and I think this is one of them. So like the opera is, the game itself is kind of an opera. The opera in the game kind of reflects what's happening in the game. And the opera sort of reflects in a way, it doesn't reflect, but it serves a purpose. The only real purpose that it serves is like making the romantic connection between Locke and Celeste a little bit more explicit.
Yeah.
So God only knows why it's there. But from a practical standpoint, God only knows why opera exists in general. Like who knows? Like, how did we get there? Right? Like, you go to the opera. For folks who are uninitiated, it sounds like they're like, it's such an alien sound that opera singers produce. It's just like, it's such a strange, it must have been such a strange concordance of events like over the course of hundreds of years that landed us with opera as we know it today. Mm-hmm. And it continues to evolve as an art form. But yeah, so in a lot of ways, like, the fact that it's an accident is, I don't know, is almost appropriate.
Right.
The fact that it doesn't mean anything is appropriate, because it also very much like serves as this memory that you as the player hold on to, much in the same way that you would hold on to seeing a good opera. When the world ends, you're still thinking about that scene, right? And you're thinking about how beautiful it was. And so even, in the ruins of this world and how gray and gross it looks, like the ocean looks like it's made of blood, you're still thinking, wow, that was such a gorgeous scene.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because, like, that's what opera does to you in real life, right? Like, there are these moments of transcendent beauty that you carry with you, like as you're in your cubicle at work. So yeah, I didn't even remember what the question was. I feel like I just went on a huge.
I know, just to talk about the opera scene really was really the whole key, because I don't think honestly, in a way, I don't think there needs to be a question for opera.
Yeah.
Opera is its own answer. I'm not a huge opera goer. I've been to a handful in my life, and I'm very up and down. There's some that I've loved. I loved like Cosi and Traviata. I saw a really good Traviata here in DC, and just did not care for Otello, right? At all.
Yeah.
It was like very different responses for me. But in this game, with this primitive voicing technology, right? I mean, of the audio system of the SNES, right? Samples, sure, but like not a lot of bit rate or space, for that matter, to make that thing sound really operatic. I mean, it's really the only way to say it. They don't exactly sound like human voices, but like you point out, opera doesn't exactly sound like you think of singing, that we mostly encounter in our day-to-day lives.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, opera in my, obviously we always talk about the voice as another instrument or as an instrument, but opera for me has always been, I've always considered it the sort of the most instrumental of ways to sing, because it is so, it is so different, and it's like in the game, because they have what they have, they're, they chose the most instrumental way to produce a voice, versus the rest of the score. But anyway,
it's interesting because like from a technical, if you're analyzing Celeste's voice as an opera singer, it's terrible. It's terrible. I mean, you can hear, right? You can hear that it's a sound sample.
Sure, yes.
But like part of that, it has to be that way, right? Like not just from a technical standpoint, but from an experiential standpoint, you have to hear something that is a very far away approximation of a human voice for Celeste to sing. Otherwise, it takes you out of the experience of the game, because you're not seeing a real human face, right? You're seeing like
throws you in the Mario pit.
Exactly, the Mario pit. Exactly. It's like you're seeing like her face.
I'll leave people to read the book on that one.
You're seeing like her face is like an 8x8 square or something. So you need to hear something that sounds like an 8x8 square of a voice. Otherwise, it doesn't. It breaks the illusion of the game.
Yeah.
And so that's why I find it really jarring when I hear live, like people have recorded the opera like live. They've arranged it for orchestra and performed it live as an opera, and I just find that really I find it really uncomfortable to listen to. Not because the singers or musicians are bad or the arrangements are bad or anything, but because it does shatter that illusion of the game, and so like. I don't know, like you're thinking about it in context of the game, and it's just like that wouldn't work. That wouldn't work. Yeah. And that's one reason.
It'd have to look like Final Fantasy VII remake, right? You'd have to bring that level of fidelity, today's fidelity, to even make it make any sense.
Exactly. Yeah, and so in some ways, I hope that they never try that with this game. Like when I heard they were remastering Final Fantasy VI, I was like, thank God it's a pixel remaster, because oh boy, if they tried to do something like with Final Fantasy VII, it just wouldn't. I don't think it would. I don't know if it might work.
I would think it would be very hard, because I think one of the things you point out, I think in you were in some of the introductory stuff just about opera more generally, and some of the things that you're talking about in Puccini and all that stuff. Like normally how we even see opera. It's not like we're there on the stage, but of course, in a video game, you can put the camera wherever, and you're not going to put it up in the upper balcony, right, to see this opera, right? And even though that's their perspective, in the game, I don't think that they'd have close-ups. They'd want to have the money shots of just how close and how gorgeous this model is, right? And that would make it not work, I think, in some ways as well.
Yeah, they do have they do that a little bit with the there's the Met Opera streams some of its
true, yeah,
in the theaters, which is fine. But like when you were saying that, I was thinking of Ingmar Bergman's film The Magic Flute, which is a film of the opera. And when I saw it for the first time, I thought it was hilarious because the two quote unquote main characters of the opera are Tamino, a tenor, a prince, and Pamina, a princess, a soprano. And they're supposed to be these young, I don't know, teenagers, early 20s characters. But when they show Pamina's face for the first time in this movie, you can tell that she's 40. Right. She's an opera singer. She's not you're not meant to see her up close like that.
Right.
And so it's funny to me that you mentioned that, because it just made me think of that.
It's like Branagh doing Hamlet when he was 50.
Yeah, Branagh also did a film version of The Magic Flute, and it's wild, guys. It's crazy.
Oh, I don't know that one. Oh wow! I mean, I've seen the Bergman one, but on the big screen even. But,
Branagh, it wasn't received particularly well. I don't know. I don't know if it worked, but there's some really cool moments in it, I think.
Yeah, neat. Well, on the note, as it were, of the Magic Flute, we want to we'll probably draw this to a close and be respectful of your time. But this was a great conversation, and thank you so much for touching on some of the stuff that's in the book. There's a lot more. First of all, I want to let people know, I had a number of notes that we didn't get to here, and I just threw in the Mario pit because I was like, damn it, I want to get that in there, and people need to go and follow it up.
I'm happy to keep going. I could talk about this for forever.
I can't because my throat. But But no, it's been a delight to have you, and about a subject again that we are not well equipped to talk about. It's really nice to have an expert on to talk about this sort of thing, especially for a game that does such great things with music. So I thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm chuffed to be here. Why did I say chuffed? I'm happy to be here. I don't know why I said chuffed. I never used that word.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sebastian. And
thanks, Sebastian.
Look for the book, which is already out. You can get either a hardcover or a hard copy in a paperback, or the ebook. Both are great, and you really don't need to be a musician to enjoy and get a lot out of it. So thanks again.
Oh, yeah, of course. My pleasure.
Welcome back from the break. That was a fascinating conversation.
I
really
fun.
Loved it. Yeah, it's really, really great. And I want to shout out Gabe Durham again for putting us in touch. And again, Ryan Biostats for suggesting the idea. Not something we do a lot of. We try to get developers, right? And that's kind of our thing. But for this type of subject, it's often difficult for us to do that well, for music in particular. So
yeah,
really, really glad Sebastian could come on and talk. And great congrats to him on his book, because it really is a great read. And the whole series, the ones I've read I've read some of the games we played. I also read the Spelunky book, and it is a really good series, and always kind of different perspectives. Like the Spelunky book is written by Derek Yu, who made it, but often just fans or appreciations or unique lenses. ZZT, the book, the one that's written by Anna Anthropy, talks a lot about how ZZT, which is an early Epic Games title by Tim Sweeney, back when he founded it, I think that was his first thing. It was like a ASCII game on personal computers. Here I am.
Oh.
Next time I'll be calling it www.devgameclub again. But it's a really interesting, because it was abstract and you could sort of explore a lot of stuff with it, I guess is the part of the thrust of that book. Anyway, super interesting series, and they're doing great work. And Sebastian's is a great addition to the series from my perspective. So highly recommend it. Really have enjoyed reading it, and I will probably read another third of it tonight before I go to bed. So terrific stuff. Anyway, we're just here at the end. We're not going to do any of the reviews or anything or feedback this week. We're going to catch up on all of that next week. You can send your email to devgameclub@gmail.com. And, of course, we love your reviews through the podcast infrastructure, through Apple Podcasts. If you use anything else, just let us know. And we will catch up on all of that feedback, as well as giving our takeaways on this game, which I probably will prepare on the fly, then, even though I said we should take another week.
I also forgot.
It also often happens. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com or on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
You are also twitching. That sounds a little wrong. At twitch.tv/Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end. And you are still stretching hands across strands across America? Hands, strands.
Yeah, I don't know how many chapters there are, but I'm in chapter 8, so I think I'm getting there. Feels like there's some crescendos happening.
There's 49 chapters.
Oh, right, of course. Yeah, it's a Kojima game. So, yeah, not done.
Chapter 42, nobody really counts as a real chapter because it's just 20 minutes of jamming the square button. But
oh, yeah, for you. Yeah. No, unskippable. You can't. Yeah. Oh, you're talking about the microwave hallway. Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I still it's... it's a Kojima game, so there's certain things that you aren't always the greatest. But this is a special game, though. I mean, they are doing some crazy stuff with it that I am very much enjoying. So if you're interested, if you're not interested, especially if you're not going to play the game or you're not interested in playing the game, I think watching whether it's me or anybody, you should look it up because it's fascinating. There's definitely a lot of the usual Kojima shenanigans going on, especially with the story. But as far as the game design, it's, I don't know, just such a bold, risky thing. Like it's not the kind of game that gets greenlit, to be honest, not at this budget.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's really fascinating to play, but I also enjoy it. It's been fun to play too for me. I mean, it checks a lot of boxes for the kind of player I am.
Oh, I see what you did there. Yeah. A lot of boxes.
Yep.
Anyway, that's Mondays at 7 p.m. Pacific time for those who want to follow along. And I occasionally stream. I'm back to occasional streaming at twitch.tv/Brett Douville. I was playing Dragon Quest Builders and got just super busy lately. I was still doing Final Fantasy VI and have not been able to get back to it. But I will at some point. I haven't been playing any. That's it. That's all I'm playing. And if I'm not streaming it, I'm probably not playing. So I've just been, with all the things I've got going on, I have not had a lot of time for that. But I'll get back to it. You can see me subscribe and all that stuff, and you get the notifications. In any case, our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friendly cast Aaron Evers, and our logo is by Mark Garcia. Have fun practicing your arpeggios this week, and good night.
Good night.